Good evening, everyone. If you were here a moment ago, you will know that we actually had a short stream with a technical difficulty from my side, apparently, leading to us not being able to do as much as we'd like. But the stream has still been restarted, and creation of the setup. So we're now back to normal, more or less. Except that I didn't create the lounge, but this really shouldn't affect much of anything. Still having the great challenge of playing this game after playing Melty Blood, as the feelings and flows are similar, particularly for characters, but the precise thing that happens when you do specific moves changes a lot. For example, having to actually walk up to do your throws. Such work. Oof. You know what they say, -2 is +2 if you believe. So as mentioned, today we are dealing with blocking and specifically guarding in order to contain your opponent's offense while still managing to keep up with the other mechanics this game offers. This is harder to do correctly in neutral because doing it in neutral means that you must spend more time feeling like your opponent is definitely going to attack and knowing which style of attack they're going to do. Since just blocking, a lot of things in pure neutral are not as telegraphed, so you can just guard this way. But there are good reasons to not guard that way if you think your opponent is going to have time to deal with it. You can, of course, depending on the gaps in their strings, do this regardless. You can just start blocking correctly and shield at the right timing regardless. But the main reason you care about doing any of this at all is simply to get your Vorpal, to get control of that position from the gauge at the bottom of the screen. The wind shields Once you've learned proper combos in this game, you are only really going to be unable to land those against players who know how to manipulate neutral to prevent you from doing that. But learning how to use this specific mechanic correctly against long pressure is another good way of dealing with it. Simply blocking will usually allow your opponent to control the pressure string in the way that they want to. Whereas, if you manage to do the shielding correctly, even for air moves, the changes to the way that the characters interact, in terms of the spacing they're put at and the frame data of the punishes that you normally have to do, will make it harder for them to be sure long enough to get it set up. And similarly, it's harder to actually confirm that your combo will hit as it should. Let's go with should. If you've been pushed out, even if your opponent did mess up and fail the block or the shield. So to shield the first couple of hits, think it's time to get out of the situation and then be wrong is still a real strength against your opponent, even if it barely reduces your damage. Better and better opponents will have more and more ways of dealing with the problem. They will have better reactions, they will have better combos, they will have better timings. But in general, you don't care so much, because the better you get at what you're doing anyway, the more you will have a way around the situation. The continual changing of the space between the two players is something you can't get used to entirely, because it's just adding to your mental stat no matter what you do. This is even more meaningful against characters like Aurier, who gain advantages by continuing their strings at positions where your character isn't able to respond. Now, you'd think that anything where you end up getting pushed out further against a character you need to get in on would technically be bad, but it does depend a lot on both when the player stops their combos and your understanding of how to slip through her moves. Simply put, if you can make one of her block strings miss one of the moves in it early, and you know that that move is going to miss, you can use this time to set up a counterattack that's probably going to whiff punish the move itself. This often allows you to do specials that would not be a good idea normally, not necessarily because they're not safe, but because you normally wouldn't have enough time to execute them due to their long startup. Against a character who could basically cross the screen immediately, this comes up a lot. But if she is in defensive positions, or has just been in a whiff punish situation where she now must recover from whatever it was she was doing, your options are a lot better. This also, of course, works if your character is good in footsies and just has long-range mid-normals. higher level of this skill is another one you can see, particularly because it's Nanase moving around and playing. One can intentionally, with moves, put yourself in a position that suits you and then correctly guard, i.e. shield, the opponent's check or counterattack. This will both give them the opportunity to hit a button and be wrong, and give you a spacing you can use to trick them into letting you hit them with something large, usually. Even though that a good player will obviously learn most of these positions, it's still, again, some addition to their mental stack. They have to understand what's happening and be ready for it, and just being ready for more things is simply always harder. This can also be done with dashes, if you build up the skill for it, but the dashes tend to be a little more... People are more likely to check dashes than they are to react with a hit to moves that they aren't sure are intended to hit them. Obviously, you also get the people who have extremely good spacing understanding, extremely good reactions, and they will just hit you out of moves even though the move normally would be difficult to do. Like, the move is set to hit them. If they tried to deal with it when it was going to hit them, they'll get destroyed. But they recognize or realize they've moved to the spacing where this move is not going to hit, and because it's not going to hit, I also have the option to use this counter, or just wait and hit you when you land. Usually it's an air move that is doing this simply because they're the easiest ones to get away with in this raid. Nanase is able to spend a lot of time in the air doing this sort of thing, but picking up on needing this to be your skill set can be a little harder at first. It's also one of those, you could say, soft skills that comes up in fighting games, which often makes the characters seem weaker than they are, mainly because if you attempt to play in the straightforward way, or don't understand how to do certain tricks and are looking at moves from the frame data perspective, or the pressure and keeping control perspectives, it's much harder. Similarly, if you fight opponents who can just react to everything and learn every single spacing, you can't rely on those tricks in a basic way. You have to be very good at making their lives absolutely miserable to the point where they just can't keep it up. For this reason, in a lot of situations, one would have to assume that these characters are weaker, quote unquote. But at the end of the day, overwhelming even some of the best players has to be a style, because otherwise, particularly good defensive characters would just never lose anything. And we do see that games tend to switch toward that over time as players get better and better and better. Defensive characters become more viable, sometimes to the point of being really stressful. Fortunately, it's not often necessary to nerf them entirely because they are usually only very good in the hands of players who have been playing for a long time. And by the time the game's been going on long enough, everyone has a good idea of ranks, and therefore you don't find a lot of mid-level players trying to use this character in order to get a big advantage, because most of the time they just don't. That sort of thing is what I was just... The sort of thing I was referring to is what you just saw. For basically none of those rounds did Omni actually respond by trying to hit Nanase out of the air with that strike. But realizing, oh, you're drifting a little too low, you didn't stop at the height to do the fireball, so I'm now going to hit you. That's a fighting game practice sort of issue. You gain these abilities by playing nearly any game 3D ones make it a little harder to learn the levels of it required for 2D game stuff, especially this type of 2D game. But even those will get you into the right mindset for it long enough probably for you to pick up on these things. Similarly, if you're not particularly jumpy as a person and tend to have enough calm to understand when your opponent cannot actually pose a full threat to you, it's easier to remain completely still or to understand exactly where you can move to without stressing yourself out much. The less stressed you are, the easier it is to react to just about anything really, or rather anything you're familiar enough with to react. This is partially why it's a good idea to learn a lot of pressure if you want to go into the higher ranks of most games. Not necessarily because pressure always wins, but because if you want to make sure that your opponent has to deal with you, you can't necessarily rely on any given skill in neutral. Nothing short of basically being able to teleport literally in front of your opponent's face, and sometimes not even that, because most moves like that are unsafe and usually largely so. So the only thing your opponent has to do is keep blocking. You'll end up needing the pressure just to put enough stress on their mind to get away with doing other things. Normally, without a guest coming in though, you don't actually see that much pressure, simply because well, the first point is that we are generally not terribly good at it, and the second point simply being that because of the way that interactions work and knowing the other player well enough, it's harder to decide when pressure would actually help in some way. Most of the time, you would benefit more from playing neutral and understanding which neutral you are going to win at when you play against someone you understand quite well. But we do have the joy of being able to do this from this range. You note though that even Oria's corner guard sort of falls apart because of the massive change in pushback that her moves experience when shielded correctly. In fact, making your opponent have to think about the fact that you're going to change their range when they are doing corner guard things is super important. Generally, you're better off just not doing it all of the time. If you're the sort of person who shields by default, then you should spend some time, especially if you've got high health, specifically not shielding. But this is again against new opponents, and that's why it comes up. If you're facing a new player who has not fought you before, and you convince them that your default is to block without shielding, you may be able to get a better advantage later on in the match when you are stressed and have to fall back to your default. But it doesn't work when you're facing people who you are very confident that you understand. That was an air throw that whiffed. I'm not sure why it whiffed. Probably because Omni hadn't hit a button yet. Characters with relatively sudden instanced moves that can be used for whiff punishes often get the most benefit out of this if you can get the execution right. Seth has a lot of moves that are quite slow, relatively speaking, and some that are decent speed but hard to execute. But being a generally short-range character, he has one main option that always comes up. Being able to just literally flash step teleport across the screen with a strike and defeat the opponent that way temporarily. But this move is in no way invincible. It's simply too difficult for most people to react to if they didn't think it was coming for some reason. And therefore, unlike Oryu, who can basically go, I'm going to space this perfectly so that I don't get hit, Seth is counting almost entirely on the idea that you're not going to be ready for this move. Or, what you just saw. You are ready, but the concept that it's going to be done in that position isn't something that's occurred to you. Opponent 2 ready, and I should have gone for baiting it. The problem with this approach for moves that work like that is that not only are they hard to execute in themselves, they're explicitly harder to do out of the shield state. That wasn't actually worth the conversion. Something I don't mention very often because it's so tiny, but it often can make a difference if you are in a position to suddenly win a match that you were expecting to go on longer. If you think you have a moment to do a punish, or a relatively assured punish, you do that cancel to convert your GRD gauge into regular meter for the next round. I think I would have lost that anyway because the only other thing I was going to do was the same instant forward dashing thing. But I expected my opponent's main state to be defense, and it wasn't, so I died. With a blank mind, my opponent is probably going to punish literally anything I do at shorter ranges. Unlike Melty Blood, where most of the time combos tend to scale very, very poorly, this game seems to go on with allowing a lot more of the damage to be retained. Specifically, I feel like they spent more time balancing exactly where certain moves are prorated and which ones do a lot of damage regardless of the fact that you've just done something else. It's that extreme readiness that makes it so hard to land most of these attacks. And that's true on both sides. My opponent is specifically trying to get away from having to try to attack where I am on the screen, because if I anticipate them even a little bit, I have basically mobility in any direction with this character at nearly all times. Seth has to be in the middle of a large move to not be able to go wherever he feels like. And this means that nearly every option you have for an attack can be evaded in one way or another. Some of your slowest attacks might be possible to just I guess you could say you could just hit them because what will happen is a spacing issue. But generally, if you're thinking, I'm going to attack you because you are in that spot, it will generally fail. Is one of the things I teach people who fight against me the earliest. Do not attack where Seth is. Or if you must, use as much as you can from your arsenal of moves that have really confusing reach or large movement spaces. If you can do this consistently enough, particularly on characters who have good neutral and longer range in a general sense, you won't have as many problems dealing with the whole I can go anywhere I want anytime. And then you can focus on reacting to those positions. As demonstrated there, a character with shorter range might not have been able to land that strike in order to stop Seth from doing something in time, but Ori will manage. And even that could easily have been just me thinking that a certain thing would hit and my opponent knowing that it wouldn't and being ready to counterattack. Once you get used to the idea that Seth does not need to be attacked where Seth is standing, or even where you think Seth is about to move to, because this doesn't work quite as well either, and that your focus needs to be more so on either setting up a spacing you like, or putting a move in front of you that Seth should not be able to punch through, it's a lot easier to handle the matchup. Similarly, just defending correctly, while it may be slow and require a lot of focus because of the number of options the character has, you can still at least try for that as a core thing. Similarly, this comes up to what I was noting to begin with. The more likely you are to be out of the position Seth expects you in when Seth lands a hit, the harder it is to complete the correct combo. In Seth's case, the defense, the evasion part of this character is also embodied in that. Because regardless of what else is going on, you have to face the same problem. If you're both consistently out of the positions that you expect, it's harder for you to finish your combos as well. Understanding how to pressure this style of character isn't necessarily all that hard because, I mean, there's not a lot of things Seth has as invincible or confusing options on Wake Up or similar situations. But that means that I spend a lot more time figuring out how exactly to shield to get to a position that I want to. So while you may be able to overwhelm this sort of player when they don't have meter, and even sometimes manage to use some corner guard options, you are still going to find yourself thinking sometimes, why do I keep on having to deal with all of these specific mix-ups when I'm the one on the offensive? The better you get at it, the harder this whole thing becomes as a whole, and you then start to end up playing something closer to a Touhou game. For example, even there I had something that was completely intentional. When blocking against the Nase, I normally don't shield the first two hits. She has definite pressure strings, but she tends to put herself out of the range of anything really frustrating or confusing fairly fast. As she's just not built to be a pressury character as a core thing. She's about as good as any other character in the game that isn't immediately in your face all the time. If my opponent chooses to stop hitting buttons after the first two strikes in the string, but I had shielded the first two strikes, Seth is usually out of range to properly hit and do combos. If my opponent chooses to use the third strike, this is normally an advantageous position for them. But I don't necessarily want that to happen, obviously, so I shield the third one in case they don't continue. Being willing to trade helps as well. Doing this correctly is a little harder for Akatsuki because as a character he tends to have less high mobility moves for some reason. He has very solid play in almost every aspect, but isn't necessarily going to be tricking people into a lot. Fortunately, being hard to trick, even if part of the reason for that has more to do with the fact that his moves are very reliable, is still good. His main stressor, therefore, is that he ends up being a character who often needs to just start by jabbing. He does have a good enough overhead to make things complicated, thankfully, And it has good range, so you can use it in more situations than you might expect to. But in the end, having to strongly and constantly defend is really rough. We've had Akatsuki on this stream before who didn't actually try to play this way consistently, but the big problem that comes up there is that if you do have an uppercut or anything that is strongly invincible in a specific space, he's relatively easy to counter. It doesn't help that his parry does actually care about height. This might slow down your opponent's attack style, but it won't necessarily save you from much. One thing that does help though is the fact that the parry itself can be executed relatively easily. It's basically one button, and you can therefore do it when you've shielded correctly and therefore bought yourself more time against a specific move type. In a match with Nanase you would see it more, but I'm not Nanase, so... Why is it reporting Omni has 0 matches? It's kind of odd. The 3 consecutive win rule is in effect. So I am out, and we get to see Ori versus Nanase again. Best stage to end the stream on too, because we are coming to the end of the stream. Despite our relatively late start, I guess, due to the issues, we're still probably not going over by a lot. There may be a shift based on who wins this, because you might get to see some stuff. But I'm not really sure that it would be worth putting out extra time. After all, people have lots of other things they like to do. And this is one of our quieter streams where people don't have as much to show because we're not fighting new players. And if you're used to watching us fight in general, this looks the same as it always does. This is partially because the thing we're working on today is so subtle that if you don't understand the characters themselves really well, you can't necessarily see what's happening. But that's true in a lot of games. The mid-level of these games doesn't have a specific look to it most of the time. The high level has a really specific look to it, but you won't necessarily understand it. And the lower level of the game doesn't contain the aspects required to cause you to think about it that way. take anything away from this though, understand that against opponents who are likely to keep their pressure going a lot, who aren't the type to go, okay, I'm going to stop doing my pressure so that I can try to break your defense some other way with some less safe move or a throw. Against those people, just shield the entire thing. You will get much more out of it in almost every case. The reason to shield intermittently, to shield randomly, or to even shield quote-unquote incorrectly, sometimes actually shielding incorrectly outright will help you, but not often because it will break your GRD gauge. All of those things are for people who are likely to try to open you up in some other way. Whether that be using Assault to dash, and they're trying to get a spacing that suits them, or just hoping that they can get close enough to grab you. Your aim is to mess with those people's spacing as much as possible, especially if they're the type who are going into basic, very close range pressure, the type that you can't easily defeat by hitting your own buttons. Because what you want, above all else there, is to make sure you do not lose control of the situation. Even if that means taking a hit, taking a throw, it's important to know which thing is going to get through, rather than just trying to defend everything. Obviously, if your health is low, you're not in a position to make that decision, but there are definitely times where you have enough health to go, okay, I'm going to do this because the only thing that will hurt me is option A. And if I can get my opponent to think about option A enough, I may be able to defeat them later, or option A is the reactable one, it's just that I'm not good at reacting to it. Those sorts of things are very important. The more complicated the game, the more this comes up. And this game is complicated, especially in terms of its combo theory. You can never be sure that your opponent can't continue a combo. You can only understand that they have difficulty, or that there may be a spacing at which it's troublesome. The tiniest of slivers. I want to do the closeout, but I kind of wanted the stream to go on for one more fight if Moon Siren wins. So, yeah. That said, at least some of that information is given to you regardless. So, you can find all of our bots for this game, training inputs basically, at our website 2-mk.org. And information on all of our spot releases, as well as when we are streaming, on our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. And with that, Omni seems to have brought the stream to an end anyway, with a huge downswing of an ethereal sword. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.